Josh Owen is a really exciting guy. I think you're going to find him fascinating. We talked and talked and talked after I picked him up at the airport. Really interesting guy. He graduated from Cornell University in 1994 with a BFA in sculpture and a BA in visual studies. In 1997, he received an MFA in furniture design from the Rhode Island School of Design. Josh is currently an associate professor of industrial design at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he previously taught at Philadelphia University, where he held the Craig R. Binson Chair for Innovation. He also teaches a product design course at the University of Pennsylvania School of Design. He's founder of Josh Owen LLC. His professional projects are produced by major international manufacturers, including AreaWare, Casamania, Kickerland, and Umbra. He has been the winner of 3 Chicago Athenaeum Good Design Awards, the International Design Award, and has received honorable mentions for the ID Annual Design Review and the Red Dot Design Award. Josh is the author of the book Big Ideas, Small Packages, and his work is included in the permanent design collections of the Centre Georges Pompidou, the Denver Art Museum, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Chicago Athenaeum, and the Musée des Beaux-Arts de Montreal. His work has been featured in major exhibitions, numerous books on design, and is regularly included in critical design discourse. Wow, pretty impressive. Welcome, Josh Owens.
I think so. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. It's always fun to step out of your comfort zone and visit other schools and cities. I'm just a little bit sad that I don't have more time to be here and to get into your studios and see what you're all up to. Does this sound okay to everyone? Yeah? Okay. Although Andy did give me a quick tour through the studios, and I had a chance to see what some of the freshmen are up to and to see some of the output across the areas. And it looks like you guys are having a good time. Are you having a good time? Yeah. Good. All right. Well, let's get to it then. Let's see if we can turn this on. All right, here we go. So I think I have to show you this slide. This is important. And this slide, which is also important. But I put it in my typeface, the one that I use for everything, so it's a little bit cleaner looking. I was asked what the title of the lecture is, Lenses Design, what does it mean? We're going to find out. My work as a professional, and that's what I'm here to talk about primarily today, is very much focused on working between professional activities and academic activities. And in order to find ways to create synergies, I've tried lots of things. And finding simple is the hardest part of working, I think, between academics and practice. And so this is kind of the subtitle for the lecture. I think in today's day and age, it's quite important to play for keeps. As a product designer, as an educator, as one who brings things into the world, it's important that the things that we bring both embody meaning and have embedded in their reality a reason to be that extends their life. Heirloom products are a way of thinking about making these objects of meaning or making contributions that don't find their way to the landfill. And I think this idea of finding simple is a way of streamlining or thinking about making products which address a need that has an urgency that can go on beyond their immediate discourse. We're surrounded by what I like to call encoded objects, objects that are full of stories, or full of meaning, or full of material and technological aspects. And our jobs as designers are not just to encode objects, but also to decode them and to understand what the systems and the thinking that realize these objects are, and how we can use those systems and those ways of thinking to bring better objects into the world. Just to give you an idea of my background, how did I come to design? And you heard my credentials are not traditional industrial design background. I studied at Cornell something like anthropology and visual studies and sculpture. And the reason I think I moved into those areas out of high school is because I grew up with an archaeologist father. I spent most of my summers going with him on these excavations, mostly in the Middle East. And I loved it. It wasn't the Indiana Jones image that you might be conjuring. There were no bullwhips and cool coats and giant balls chasing you through a cave. It was a slow, methodical process, a grueling process of peeling away layers of earth in the search for stories, for understanding stories, understanding cultures, understanding what materials and technologies were used to develop artifacts for daily life. And I found it fascinating. Even as a 7-year-old kid, I was there at 4 in the morning with a pickaxe as best as I could manage, pulling away these layers of earth and sort of chasing the mystery, chasing the unfolding puzzle. So I think that it's somewhat obvious that those kinds of influences really drove me towards understanding materials, technologies, objects, and so on and so forth. I wonder if can we get the lights down a little bit, or I don't know if that's possible. It seems like these might be a little blown out image-wise. Some examples of things that I collect as I kind of move about. I think many of us as designers are collectors. We're intrigued by objects, sometimes cars or sneakers, right? The list goes on and on. For me, and Andy and I were talking a lot about this earlier, the world is just full of interesting things, and it's our job to understand them. So on the left is a felt slipper. It's a shoe, really, from Siberia. And what I think is fascinating about that object is there's really no design there. This is a kind of perfect synergy of materials and technology and human need in this little vehicle. It's just shaped around a foot, kind of a universal shape that you can get in and out of. The only discernible detail is a tab that enables you to easily slip it on and off. And felted wool is a renewable resource. It wicks moisture away from the body. It's buoyant on heavy snows. So everything about this design is perfect for its environment. And for me, that's where the beauty comes from, in that kind of harmony with its environment and its material use and so on. On the right is something I found hiking in the Peruvian Andes. There they make their sandals from old tires that emerge all over the place there. And it's hard work to make those sandals. If you've ever tried taking a not so terrific knife and hacking through a steel-belted radial tire, it's a bit of work. But they're incredibly robust, and they last a really long time. Again, no design in there, but using efficiencies from the world around them. And another example of this kind of icon of a bag, which for hundreds of years, maybe more, were made in this method from leather. So for me, design is a lifestyle. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of behaving. It's a way of interacting. It's a holistic practice that borders on religion, I suppose. And so we, as designers, we construct our lives around these principles. I like this slide because it shows my priorities. And academics and practice exist on the same plane as I suggested earlier. And that creates certain opportunities and certain synergies that I'll get to. This is I need to update this for my new life in Rochester. I was in Philadelphia for more than 13 years, teaching at Philadelphia University and operating my studio. And I used to live in an old cigar factory. I now live in a house in the woods along the Erie Canal. But I still create these efficiencies by having the studio attached to the house. The university is close by. You'll find in life that things become complicated, and your job is to figure out how to do all the things you want to do. So as a designer, that's our bread and butter. So I'm in Rochester now, and I like this slide because it locates me. The Pittsford Village is where it is because of the Erie Canal. It was the first settlement in 1789 in the Rochester area. The city of Rochester came later. But as you can see, it's on a major trade route there, with the Erie Canal being that white line that passes through the Pittsford Village. This is a shot of my studio that was on some blog site a while back. Somebody told me they saw it, and the funny thing was, on these like Design Boom or Design Milk or whatever site it was, they put in these comments, like they allow you to comment, and so everybody wants to comment. They're not all brilliant comments. And somebody said, it's too clean to be a design studio. I never really lower myself to jump into these conversations because it's a black hole. But I would have jumped in and said, we photographed it the day after we finished it. So it really is not so clean anymore. In any case, so the studio is small, but it's sort of the right environment for the work that I do, and it has just what I need. One of the advantages of kind of moving your life is to reevaluate how you work. And so after 13 years of working in an old cigar factory, this new setup allowed me to kind of design and build just the right studio for me. So I like to say Rochester is strategically dislocated. Rochester has a mixed rap, maybe like Detroit does, and there are things which are both easy and hard about being in a place which is not New York City. But this map kind of shows that strategic dislocation. We're very close to some wonderful natural areas, and we're not so far off from urban areas either. I mean, I regularly am in New York City to shake a hand and come back and tuck my kids into bed afterwards because it is a 1-hour flight. The landmark organizations in Rochester consist of Eastman Kodak, that you probably know about, Frontier, Xerox, Bausch & Lomb, and we're just down the street from Corning, which is a really interesting player, among others. So this gives Rochester a very unique kind of aspect. We have kind of a white-collar industry presence that goes back to its founding, and then we've got a huge educational presence with University of Rochester and their medical center, which is one of the best in the country, and also RIT. So maybe a bit like you, for me the competitive advantage of RIT is that we have a design school, a robust design school within a university setting. This is not going to be, the lecture today is not about RIT, but just to give you some context for my work there, RIT is a large school. We have 18,000 students. And the campus is situated there along the Genesee River. The brewery is just at the end, Andy. And we are the College of Imaging Arts and Sciences at the heart of the campus. And the College of Imaging Arts and Sciences has a number of schools, one of which is the School of Design. And all these sort of fingers that we reach to are the different aspects of the university which we make good use of. A few of them are the Center for Student Innovation, which is a kind of incubator for student projects that come from engineering, come from design, business, the health sciences, and you regularly walk through there and see all kinds of interesting collaborations going on. One of which I was just talking about earlier, one of our students I found out night before last won $100,000 at the, of pocket money, I'm told, at the Mass, what is it called, Mass Challenge? Something like that in Boston for a project which was incubated here in the Innovation Center. This was a pretty big deal for him, and the funny thing of the story with Sean, who's in one of my classes right now, is I saw him today to congratulate him on his $100,000 winning for his project. And I said, I have to leave class a few minutes early, otherwise I'd talk to you about it more. And he said, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Lawrence Tech. And he said, I almost went to Lawrence Tech. It's a really great school. So there's a plug for you guys. The $100,000 man likes you. I should run it up the flagpole here, yeah. The other thing that we have going for us, which is new, is the Vignelli Center for Design Studies, which was just put in place 2 years ago as I walked in the door there. The Vignelli Center is an archive of Massimo and Lella Vignelli's life's work, and they're among probably the most notable graphic, architect, industrial design people that are still working. And you might know their work from the subway map, the New York City subway map that they did, but many other sort of ubiquitous products as well. And what we have is every cocktail napkin sketch, every model that they ever made. It's really an amazing collection, which we use as teaching tools. And the other piece that I was talking about earlier is the Golisano Institute for Sustainability. This is a rendering, but the building's almost done now. And so we've just minted an architecture program, which is not built within a design framework, but within a sustainability framework, which will be create some interesting opportunities for us. The industrial design program, the undergraduate was ranked number 3, and the graduate program number 2 in design intelligence last year. So we feel we're doing something right. So, with regard to my practice, I think of my work in 3 kind of models. One is working by experiment, the second by client, and the third is an academic track. And this is where the mixing happens. You can see by looking at these sort of trajectories that, that many kind of have similar touchstone points along the way. So there's a lot of potential for overlap. Conceptual framework for this lecture is built on a talk that I've been doing for some time now that looks at kind of theory and process. And the theory part, I'm going to take you through some lenses for design, as I call them, which we'll look at experiments and client-driven work. And then with regard to process, we'll talk about 2 case studies, and then we'll pull it together at the end. So for these experiments, these have become teaching tools for me, looking at product design through these different lenses. And I'm just going to talk about a number of them. So anachronistic adaptation. I think you all know that what we're looking at on the left here is probably a smartphone, maybe an iPhone, right? On the right is a drawing of a cuneiform tablet, which is really our first organized writing system. And I show you this because I think it's important that we're reminded as designers that, that we're always held accountable to the human condition. And while things change dramatically and we have a habit of getting ahead of ourselves with technology, there's still things that are very much important to consider, like the touch and feel of something, the radius of an edge, and what our limitations are in terms of what we can see and what we can process. So this project was for a company called AreaWare, which is a Manhattan-based boutique design company, and it's a Menorah. And I picked this because I think it's it's such a common typology, and to do this project, to sort of reinvent something which is so ubiquitous and has been iterated probably millions of times as a product is a real challenge. But for me, to try to unthink what we've thought, to look for the habits that lead us to kind of sincere innovation is the challenge and the interesting part. So in the end, many people put menorahs on plates to catch the wax drippings. And so the principal innovation here is that this is a plate combined with a candelabra. But it's also thinking through the materiality. It's cast iron. It's got a substantial weight to it and a good feel. And it, it insulates there when you put the match on it and so on and so forth. And this has been a strong seller and actually just was accessioned into the National Jewish Museum in Philadelphia's collection. Another example of anachronistic adaptation, looking at these wonderful sub-Saharan African chairs, which are kind of sliced from concentric pieces of a tree and slotted together to form the structure. This was a project that was done for a Canadian manufacturer called Umbra, which never worked out. So in other words, we went back and forth. Umbra made prototypes in Canada, US, China, and Italy. And in the end, we simply couldn't bring it in for the right price point. But it lives for me in this kind of realm of experiment. And I think an interesting kind of upgrade to an archetypical idea. Repurposing. I've lived through the period of dematerialization of music, and the jewel case was this step along the way. And witnessing people's changing value associated with how music is captured was quite interesting. And when this thing started to find its way to the landfill, I kind of puzzled over it and ended up making this piece, which has won a bunch of awards and been in different kind of exhibits about repurposing and so on. I never really thought about this as a useful product design, but it was a kind of experiment. And again, that's one of those trajectories that I like to work in, because I think it's quite important to follow that kind of thought in order to disseminate ideas. Temporal graffiti, this notion that we leave behind imprints or marks, and it's a kind of a thing that we do as human beings, led to a bunch of research around thermochromatic liquid crystals. And this was done in the, I guess, the mid-1990s, before we had ironed out the kinks in this particular material. But I had done a big project for a bar in Philadelphia. There I have a little bit more hair. And that bar was a collaboration with a company based in California that was able to engineer this material, this heat-based reaction, color-changing material to form a seamless surface on this bar top. And it was actually a really great piece for the duration that it was there before the bar turned to different ownership, and then they tore the bar out. This piece was another kind of experiment with a particular material, which was a new development in fiber optic technology. It enabled fiber optics to be flexible and offer a high degree of side lighting. And so this was experimenting with that material in a kind of product design way, but outside the realm of a consumer product, thinking about how you could use light to inform your environment and in a malleable way. This is now in the Denver Art Museum's permanent design collection. Another interesting kind of offshoot, this project was part of a constellation of products designed for Kickerland, where we were, excuse me, where we were looking at the kitchen and tools for use in the kitchen. The idea that a device for slicing cheese could also be for cutting cheese seemed like a very interesting idea, and we pursued that to develop these prototypes, and in the end, there was no market for it in the US. The owner of Kickerland happens to be a Dutchman, and so at the time they weren't distributing in Europe, and this would have been a good one for the Dutch market. but not for the US. So these are some ideas, or gives you some context for some of the experiments. And now we're going to move to some client-based work that shows you how it might behave differently when working for a manufacturer. So cause and effect, kind of very interesting idea of interface. You know, this is a close-up of a guitar amp, but we're now kind of falling away from the framework of haptic or tactical kind of interface with products in this way. We now think of digital interface much more readily. And at the time, this is also the mid-90s, I was thinking about how that interface could generate ideas. And this led to the development of a lamp, which was the first thing that I ever had in production with Umbra over in Toronto. And these are some of the studies. The end piece was this lamp that becomes brighter or dimmer on rotation. And we were still pretty much slave to the incandescent bulb when this thing went live. So while I was thinking about here using compact fluorescent, dimmable compact fluorescent technology was, you know, very, very expensive, although emergent at that time. So there was some play with trying to do that, but it didn't work out, and LEDs were really a pipe dream back then. So it had to be incandescent. It took a lot of work to get this to do what it needed to do with proper heat flow patterns and so on. But in the end, it was a good product for them, and it did well for a couple of years. Proximal relationships, thinking about how our habits and our environments kind of coalesce to create opportunities. This was, again, in that constellation of products for Kickerland's Kitchen. This was a bottle opener which has a space for a lighter in it, so thinking about those things that happen in the kitchen. And then it's magnetic, so it locates itself on a refrigerator, so your lighter is always where you need it when you need it. And there was a kind of breakthrough moment in there where we discovered that putting the magnets would also allow the cap to stick to the magnet instead of flying off into space. Simple pleasures. This was a simple product in some ways. It's just a bottle opener, and what's different about it is that it had a kind of intellectual program. I wanted to make something which was playful. I wanted to remind people that opening a bottle of wine didn't have to be a malicious act. I don't know. Does anyone have the rabbit corkscrew opener here? It's okay if you do. So it's like having a machine gun to open your wine bottle with, and I just think while this doesn't take like a political position, we as designers have to ask, does it always have to be better, stronger, faster? It's an important question to ask, and we have a habit, especially in America, of always making it better, stronger, faster. So the question is, what's appropriate language for these things? And when you think about wine, it's a ritual. It's something that is meant to be enjoyed slowly. And while we might not be so good at slow here, we're getting better. And so this was about kind of that idea of simple pleasures. Considering the void, something that designers, I think, have a habit of doing is looking for design where it doesn't exist. And so this project had to do with that in some ways. This is a bookend, which is actually, it has less waste than its ancestors in the production of folded metal bookends. What I did was created this clip without adding any welded pieces that holds in a piece of glass, and so it provides this opportunity for a picture frame at the unusual side of a bookend or an area of books. So this was actually a very strong seller with Kickerland. And Pavlovian tactics. So I quit smoking now more than 10 years ago. But when I did it, I noticed that it was hard, And there were lots of things out there which, tried to help you. And I found them incredibly inelegant, all those things, chewing gums and patches and programs and, so I thought, is it possible that the power of suggestion could help? So this was making a vessel that enabled your habit while subtly reminding you that might not be the best thing in the world for you. And this was a huge seller, actually, which was interesting. I don't know if it actually helped anyone. I'd like to think that it did. Play. Not to be underestimated what that can mean. And this is an interesting story because this was not meant to be a playful object. The salt and pepper shaker for Kickerland was a salt and pepper shaker kind of in response to, there you can see some images of it. It's magnetic, it sticks together. But it was a response to salt and pepper shakers which I had dropped and broken because they were ceramic or glass. So I started working with soft materials to come up with a solution for this salt and pepper shaker. And in the end, this magnetic project came out, which sort of rolls around on the tabletop in a very kind of indignant manner in your dinner conversation. And it was another really big hit. It was like the cover of the business section of the New York Times, and people just loved this thing. They didn't love it for the same reasons that I loved it. I loved it because it wouldn't break when it fell off the table. And if you've read Don Norman's book on emotional design, it's the same kind of story of although not as big a seller, I guarantee, as the Philip Stark juicer. Not necessarily a better salt and pepper shaker here, although it works. It just resonated with people in a way that I didn't expect, and I think that's an interesting kind of story. What's that? Yeah, could be, yeah. Parasitic relationships. This is another one which is done very well, and I was actually this morning proudly showing all the knockoffs of it to my students that are out there. But this was done shortly after Philippe Stark made a fly swatter that had a graphic varying the hole patterns on the swatter part to show a face. And so for me, this is a kind of acknowledgement of that, a kind of continuation of that conversation. Because when I designed this for Kickerland, the strict utilitarianism of this thing wasn't quite enough. So we added the fly, and I thought that was kind of a nice tip of the hat. And what's interesting now is that there's a whole line of these fly swatters that people play with the hole patterns to make different shapes and different stories. So that I feel like this was sort of second in line of this long conversation, which is interesting to see. In any case, it sells a lot, I think, because it does what it purports to do. It makes itself more accessible. That the hook on the end is scaled to fit around a doorknob, and there's a strong magnet in there, so this can always be available when you need it, which is the principal problem in fly swatters. They're not there when you need them. Same attitude in the design of this door stopper for area wear, which has also been a very good seller. And I say, by the way, when things are good sellers, because I think there's some value to understanding when something's a good seller in the marketplace, because the marketplace, pronounces judgment of many of these things. But that's not always the most important thing, which I'll talk about later. At any rate, a standard door stopper, which also acknowledges its environment by giving itself a place to rest, so you don't trip over it. Creating efficiencies is something we do as designers, right? It's our bread and butter. This is a project for Kickerland which looked at all the different measures that a bartender needs to have handy and boils them into a single cube. And so the cube facades are all evacuated in different ways to accommodate. And it's based off of this notion that a cup or a device that pours could work as a cube. The old Japanese sake cups are cube shaped. This is Kickerland, still manufactures that. Affordance, this was a project done for Design Philadelphia, which is a citywide design event, and DuPont Corient had asked a bunch of architects and me to do benches for the city and to work with DuPont Corian and their material to realize these benches. They asked us to make Philadelphia benches, and to me that meant looking at sitting culture in Philadelphia. And if anyone's been to Philly or Brooklyn or Baltimore, you'll know that stoop culture is this kind of bread and butter there. So people sit on their stoops. And so this project ended up being basically a stoop that we made out of the material and then removed from its context. But the rationale for doing this is that it actually makes a more interactive bench. Because benches are linear mostly, and so you have 2 or 3 or 4 people sitting at a bench, and the people on the end can't really talk to the other people very well. So this idea of creating other platforms enables more conversation. So it was a really interesting kind of piece to make, and then we sited it along the Schuylkill River in a kind of unusual place, and it was a pretty interesting project. Power of Suggestion. This was a project done originally for a company called Beaux-Art, but then relicensed to Kickerland. And I was just sort of inspired by the bowling pin, and so spent some time trying to figure out how I could turn that innate condition that we're all aware of, that bowling pin tells 2 stories, one when it's standing up and one when it's down, into a lamp. And the reason I show this slide, because that's the image of the piece, you know, obviously standing up, lit, and then when you knock it over, it's off, is because so much of what we do as designers is in the details. And for me, it's critically important, especially as someone who is a bit of a minimalist, that those details are just spot on all the time. So, you know, the way the chord enters, you know, was very, very important for me in this. You know, there's a lot of bad chords in the world. In fact, I had this conversation with Massimo Vignelli recently. We talked for about an hour about chords. And the other thing is that, you know, this is a product that might be for an adult, but it might also be for a child. And so there's nobody who told me that I had to make that, the connection system very, very difficult for a child to get into. We could have made it in a variety of ways, but for me, there's a kind of ethical motive there, a reason to make that a strong connection, and one that prevents, you know, a kid from getting hurt. So, so that was, you know, it's like a medicine bottle top there, and that there was a lot of work that went into making that seamless and beautiful, and also, you know, good for kids. By the way, the images that I show are all photographs. A lot of times people are confused as to whether it's a rendering or not, but these are all photos of actual pieces. I don't show any renderings in this slideshow. The indigenous population of Australia uses this term, the walkabout. And it's a kind of dream time, this idea that there's a kind of collective unconscious that we tap into. And this project was a piggy bank. It was maybe the fastest thing I've ever designed that went to production. It was done for a company called Beaux-Art, which is no more. But they asked me to do something in ceramic because they had a good ceramic factory, and they were a company that made things for adults and children alike. And so I thought, well, you don't have a piggy bank, that's a natural for ceramic, and this cocktail napkin sketch, and then the thing came back from the factory a day later or whatever, and it was shocking how well received this thing was to me. And I, you know, retrospectively think that it was because it was such a quintessential kind of caricature of a pig. You know, it was finding the most cartoony kind of likeness. The nose is a strong detail. And then, you know, at the same time, the shape was important because all the coins fall to the bottom easily to come out. And that's since been knocked off a number of times. So there are other designs like it now that this is off the market. Midlife crisis of objects is something I sort of toy with a lot. And thinking about that all objects have a lifespan, and for me, planning for that lifespan is quite important. In some ways, you can think about you know, the heirloom quality that I talked about earlier, but this uses the details to think about the things that could go wrong. So this is actually made of MDF, and it's painted. But those edges are all purposefully revealed because where things come together on those ugly brown edges, which are the color of the MDF, scuffs don't show. Mars don't show, damage doesn't show because of that color. And so those are kind of functional details that anticipate its age. And that was another strong seller with Beaux-Art. Was a kind of, we did it flat, ready to assemble. So it packed into something like a pizza box with a handle, and people would readily kind of walk out of shops buying a table, which is something you don't necessarily always do. That company went under, and that sort of intellectual property from that project got ported to a company that I had started working with in northern Italy called Casamania. And so we took that same design language and based on their technology, and yeah, sorry, it's the projector that blows out the images here, not the images. But these are some details of those larger pieces for Casamania. That's a coat rack we did using the same methodology and language. Visual sampling, this idea that we pull from popular culture in the world around us. Like the CD jewel cases I showed earlier, our currency is dematerializing. So what do you do in that kind of pimply-faced period in between technologies? And so we're thinking about the coin bank and how it could be appropriated for this company, Casamania. And they like the idea of kind of using a storage space, either in the home or the office, to kind of clean up that mess. Excuse me. These are just some shots of the rotational molding for this, which is done in a factory in northern Italy. And there's a shot of it. Exploring parameters. This is really one of my favorite projects, actually. And it's going to be hard to see because of the projector, but this is probably the highest volume of any piece that I've done in terms of manufacturing. But this I have a utility patent on, and it's hard to see, obviously. It's like a ghost product right now, but really what we're looking at is a report cover that has a patented clip on it. And the interesting thing about this, maybe you've never thought about it, but when you write a paper in college or in high school, you might put it in a fancy plastic binder and then give it to your teacher to grade. Well, as teachers, the first thing we do is we take it out of that fancy plastic binder and we throw that thing in the recycling bin. We put a staple in it because we need to be able to fold it over and mark up the things that you've said and get it back to you. So this actually looks at that activity, and what it does is it provides a report cover that has a clip that pivots over the paper. So you can insert paper in there, fold the clip down, and then fold over the cover. So it's a much more utilitarian object. Okay. So just two case studies before we kind of get through it. One, this was designed for Casamania. It's called the SOS Stool. Now, I don't expect for you to be able to read any of this stuff necessarily, but I want to take you through a timeline on a project and share with you as an independent designer how I work together with a company. So this is what happens as an independent designer. This is the company's role, and these are the places in which we intersect. This was a project that was given to me in April of 2007. The furniture industry often shows off new projects at the Salone del Mobile in Milan. It's kind of an amazing event. If you ever get a chance to go, you should go. The city of Milan's population doubles during that week. And architects, designers, everybody who's anybody. If you guys were in Europe, you'd be there. I guarantee it. The student population, all the designers go every year and they camp out. It's really an amazing event. In any case, so the brief was to design a stool, and so I walked the furniture fair with the president of the company and their marketing and engineering folks, and then I go home and come up with ideas, go back to pitch the project a few months later, and then once I've gotten buy-in on the project, I begin to generate initial models, and we go back and forth with prototypes and engineering revisions here, and then we begin a kind of story development, how to explain what the project is, how it lives within the context of the company and the world, and then tooling is here roughly around March, and then we present the project in April, and then there's some other rollout details, but that just gives you a kind of general timeline. Now, designing in this case, a rotationally molded polyethylene stool, I had a lot of constraints around making the project. The principal innovation for me was here in extending the surface of the top so that the typology blends between stool and tray. And these are just some shots of kind of figuring out that principal kind of development. And these are just very quick sketches that show the concept. I think I used some of these to pitch the idea to Casamania, and these are just images of the first models that I'll make rather quickly. And here, as we're going to tooling, what they did in this factory is use a 5-axis router to mill out these parts in styrofoam, and then they can look at the flow patterns of the plastic and hear where the seams are going to be in the mold. And that's the mold after we textured it here. And then I always get very involved in the photography in order to try and tell the story of these things accurately. So these are the images that we picked to show off the project. These are some of the final pieces after they popped out of the mold. And this shows you just some of the functionality. In that timeline, I showed some sort of post-production images, post-production information. And this was a partnership with DWR to talk about the piece. As part of Design Philadelphia, I did a lecture to describe the process. And here we showed off all the developmental sketches and stuff in this platform, and these were some of the models. So this is the release at the Salon del Mobile in Milan, these images here. And then the Biennale, which is the Architecture Biennale in Venice, bought a couple hundred of these stools, and so they sited them around the naval shipyards. And then not too long after it was released, it was inducted into the Pompidou's Permanent Design Collection in Paris. That seemed to set off a chain of these museum acquisitions. And one thing I want to mention about the museum acquisitions, for me, it's not sort of like a patting yourself on the back kind of thing. It's, as I said before, sometimes it's the marketplace that pronounces judgment and tells you that you've made a good product. But other times there are other things, like these museum acquisitions, for me, are a sort of acknowledgement of a job well done in a larger sense, in a cultural sense, that you've made sort of some sort of contribution to the lineage of design thought. The 8125 calculator was another interesting story that I thought I would tell briefly. This was designed for the oldest manufacturer of calculators in the US. They have the very first patent on the first adding machine. And they called me out of the blue one day, because they're not far from Philly, and said, we like what you do, and we're trying to figure out who we want to be when we grow up again. So we got together and we talked about their company, and we looked at their history and their trajectory, and really I sort of functioned as a consultant for a number of years before we actually got into product design. In fact, I didn't think we'd ever design a product. I thought, if anything, we'd sort of dematerialize their products. But in the end, they wanted something like a concept car as a calculator. And we not only redesigned the calculator after looking at the opportunities, but we were trying to reinvigorate the brand and to rethink their future based on their history. So these are just some examples of some of the conceptual development. In the end, we were able to reduce the footprint of this, this adding machine dramatically, reduce the parts count dramatically, and make it out of smarter materials and with smarter technology. In the end, it was a bit shocking to know that actually accountants use these things and they want these things, and there's a long story there that creates an argument for having them. But in the case of Menorah, they had, I don't know where that's coming from. It's not my slide. We're getting like a feed of what's going on. Maybe I should build that in. Yeah, we've been hacked, sorry. In any case, let's see if I can shut it off. Okay. In any case, the product did extremely well for them and boosted their sales in a huge way. And more importantly, it's not a design-driven market, and they got so many compliments from their users on this refined version of their product, because we had made these different improvements and changed the price point and made it easier for people to use. And then I also redid the brand, and they gave me carte blanche to redo their logo and all these things to reposition the product. And then a designer's work is never done. I went in and I couldn't stand the fact that this product that I had worked so hard on making better for users was going to be accompanied by a 200-page Microsoft Word document that was like reading, like arthritic, Chinese. I couldn't really see what's going on in that thing. So we redesigned the entire book, and so it's full of charts and graphs which make it easier for a user to understand the complexities of a complex machine like this. So finally, bringing these things together in some sort of convergence and trying to understand how these different tools could be used to move ideas forward is kind of what I do as an educator and a practitioner to create these heirloom products. And I recently, I think, have been doing the kind of work that I've been wanting to do all along. And so I wanted to share a couple of examples of what I think are really good projects that really contribute in meaningful ways. I did a big project with my students, and if after the fact you're interested in the student work from RIT, if you just Google me or go to the RIT website, you can see all those projects, which are pretty exciting. We spent a whole essentially a semester working with the Corning Museum of Glass, and they're an amazing resource. We had 20 industrial designers and 20 glass students collaborate to deliver ideas that we showed at the International Contemporary Furniture Fair in New York. And we had so much fun working with those folks at Corning that afterwards they invited me to come down and do something which they call Glass Lab. Which is basically they give an architect or a designer a couple of master craftsmen to work with in their live glass area and to realize ideas that you bring to the table. Oh, these are just impossible to see, I guess, because it's sort of white on white. Well, we'll do our best. At any rate, this is it's a glass cup that has these facets that accept a toothbrush. And this is a bedside bowl which has a very specific slot in it that accepts a cord but keeps the cord from falling off the table, which is, we've all had that experience. So this charges your cell phone. And this is a total ghost. But at any rate, what's interesting here is it's rethinking how you access toilet paper. And I don't know if any of you have bought the toilet paper rolls, which are tubeless. Do you know about these? They have no cardboard tube in them. Well, if you haven't seen these, they're pretty remarkable. And if you do the math and you look behind the scenes at how many hectares of rainforest we're saving by not having those little cardboard tubes in there, it's shocking. So you're sort of saving the world one toilet paper tube at a time. I've always, since they came out, I've been fascinated by that development. What's interesting about those toilet paper rolls is they don't work very well in the conventional dispensers that we have because there's no solid tube in the inside. But what I noticed is that you could just pull the toilet paper from the center and it works remarkably well, but nobody markets that. It simply hasn't been utilized. So go out there and make more product designs around that because it will make things better for us. In any case, what this is it's a glass kind of container that just organizes the toilet paper and protects it from a moisture-driven environment, and you can easily pull the toilet paper out the top. And I'm actually commercializing this with Corning right now. They've not been a manufacturer of products like this, but we're actually working on bringing it to market. We may have it ready for ICFF in May. And these are products that I've been doing for a company called Contextor. This is called the hanging line. And the idea here is that we could use these silicone rubber bands to hang things in the bathroom. And so this is basically these rubber caps and hanging items, and this is a silicone band. It's all one piece of molded material. These hooks come along with it, and they provide a series of opportunities in the bathroom. And these mirrors they just came back from the factory. I've got them sitting in my studio right now. Everything has got this kind of proprietary connection system, which allows you to locate the mirror or the hanging device very easily. And if anyone's ever installed a mirror, a hanging mirror, you'll know that it's sometimes a guessing game of precise placement because you can't see the way the hanging hardware works. Well, this makes it very, very easy. And so this one is a regular mirror, and this one's a magnifying mirror, and they kind of work in tandem. And what's really nice about this product is that because it's silicon, you can get away with all sorts of tricks in the tooling. The silicon, you can do all sorts of interesting overmolding, and you can pop the silicon out of molds where a rigid plastic piece couldn't. So there are all kinds of interesting tricks. It's basically a one-piece design. Pops out of the mold, and then you slide the glass in there and snap it into place. And this is a tissue box holder in the same line, so everything here is made of silicon. The WC line also looks at unpopular problems in the bathroom. And these are again, all silicon. There are no parts to go wrong. The only thing that you could change would be this wooden piece which threads in much the way a broom handle does. So this can be replaced. The interesting thing about silicon is it's incredibly durable. It's washable, and these could last forever, essentially. And like the fly swatter and the door stopper that I showed before, the problem with these objects is nobody wants to really live with them, and everybody wants to hide them away. And if you're hiding something like this away when you really need it, getting to it is an issue. So anyway, these have been very well received, even though they're just recently released to the marketplace. So thank you. That's the convergence at the end there that I wanted to share. And questions?
And since we are recording this, we need to get the questions through the microphone. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please hold up your hand.
Josh, you talked a lot about the idea of simplicity.
Yeah.
And talking to a group of students, could you speak just a little bit about the amount of work and rigor it takes to find that simple solution? That I think sometimes there's a misconception because it's simple that it's the first idea, but I think if you're spending time to design, it's generally what you arrive at through a lot of great editing. So can you talk about that in your end process?
Sure. There's another lecture, many actually other lectures about that. It's challenging, I think, to be in a context like this and to show ideas which which do look simple. But what I try to convey is that there are all these layers of meaning and materiality and so on that lead to these conclusions that seem like aha moments, right? You see, we all know when we see products that are important or useful that in their best case scenarios, you think, well, why didn't I think of that? It's so simple, but it's always a process of intense research and form development and material exploration. I tried to get a little bit into it with the case studies to show that there's more than just a pretty face at the end of these things. But I can't underline enough how valuable the process is and how immensely complex it is to make all those decisions. There's a great essay. Has anyone ever read anything by Naoto Fukasawa? You guys? Anybody? No? It's a great book to get. Japanese product designer, whose work I bet you've seen somewhere on a blog or whatever, and you've probably thought that's awesome. But he published a book a couple years ago, and there's a little essay in there called The 0.5 millimeter Radius. And it's a very kind of Eastern position to take, to think so carefully about something like that. But it's a vitally important conversation. He talks about why a 0.5 millimeter radius feels good in your hand and why a 0.5 millimeter radius, it could be the conclusion of lots and lots of studies on how to make something feel good. It's about human scale, and it's about kind of refining down things which are somehow quintessential. And I think that's that's one good example of just how much testing one has to do to get to something of that sort of clarity, achieving that kind of clarity. But yeah, it's always a long process of trying to achieve that end goal, which in the end seems almost as if it exists without thought.
There's a question over here.
Do you recall the name of the book that he wrote?
It's self-titled. I think it's called Naoto Fukasawa. Is that the one you're? It's Naoto. Naoto is the first name. Last name is Fukasawa. And Tashin or Rizzoli, I'm not sure of the publisher, but I'm sure if you Google it, it'll come right up. It's a very, very interesting book. I can also repeat the question if somebody.
They're going to edit all this so that you're going to edit it so that we will not see any technical glitches.
I promise I'll tell them it was perfect.
I noticed that your projects are really well documented, and that's one of the things we'll talk about when we get back to class. But I also note that you develop a narrative. Could you talk a little bit about how that is wound up in your process from start to finish, and the importance of that narrative when you are explaining to client your reasoning and what that whole process is to help clients understand what your thinking is, especially when in a situation like yours where your work is so minimal and so clean and, again, apparently simple.
Well, I think it's vitally important to be able to communicate your work in a consistent way, and it's hard to document process. You sort of want, especially in this day and age where everything is documented and everybody is blogging about everything all the time. It's also interesting to note that it's not really all that well organized. It's sort of ephemeral. But I tell my students, document everything. You never know when it'll be useful. There are so many blind alleys that we go down as designers to investigate things, and to have that research palpable at all times can be really critical. I am often sort of unpopular with my students in that I make them, coat the walls with their research, drawings and reference material. They'll say, well, it takes up a lot of space, it takes up more time, I can keep it digitally. But I think that there's something to be said for having everything visible to you at once. And documenting that process and regurgitating it, allows you to make connections that you might not otherwise take. So documenting process is hard, but it's really worthwhile, and it's amazingly useful when you're looking for work, right? You have to be able to. That's what employers want to see. They want to see the evidence of process. They want to see how you think. So it's everything for us, especially as young designers. Developing a narrative is about describing your personality or sharing who you are through your work in some ways. And for me, it's a little. I exist in this funny place between academia and practice, and so in some ways, I have the luxury of picking and choosing the companies that I work for. And so, people have said, well, your work looks, the same no matter who your client is. And that's because I've been fortunate enough to work with clients that want to work with me. And because I have a life as an academic, I might turn away a project that I think is going to lead to something that falls outside of my range of work and would push me into something an area that I don't want to go into, for example. So the narrative ends up being very much, a story of the kind of project that I think is the right kind of project to do. But I think that just to sort of speak to your question is I think it's vitally important to develop that kind of way of communicating work and using these tools of kind of capturing process and using photography to document end product as well as it's sort of everything. Especially in this world, we make, as designers, we make 3D things, and yet most of the way we communicate is in flat form. So the photographs have to be really rich and tell stories well. Does that get to your question?
It does, thanks.
Sure.
I was also talking about narrative about the product to the client.
Sure.
That's how you make it clear to them everything that's happening.
Yeah. I think that in my experience, they're very open. Clients are very open to hearing your perspective and your story, because it's only going to strengthen the way the product is delivered. So I get involved whenever I can in helping them to clarify and to tell those stories.
I have a question in the back here, and the camera, if you move just a little bit that way, because it won't stick right across your face.
Okay.
And not that we don't want the advertising.
De facto brand.
It's by design. Hi, Josh. I have a question regarding human stories. And you had mentioned that in your childhood, you had gone to the archaeological sites, and it was important to you to find out all those interesting and mysterious human stories. And I wonder if you could comment on what human story, or is there a most profound human story to you that propels you in your design work?
That's a very interesting question. Good question. I don't know that there is a single sort of story that comes to mind, but I think a lot of what I try to do is to create things which are universal, which is a kind of impossible goal. We talk about universal design, and the hope is that you can make a chair that fits everybody, but the reality is it's impossible to do that. And I guess in some ways I seek to make products which endure, and products that are useful to many, if not to everyone. So that in itself is a kind of human story that I try to access, try to make things which are meaningful and enduring. And that, it's a constant uphill battle because we are always evolving technologically and materially and so on. So I think for me that's the most challenging, human story that I'm trying to grapple with.
I think most of the things that you showed us in your work represent to me something you might find in an archaeological dig thousands of years from now, and you'd be able to pick it up and know what it was used for. So maybe you picked up some of that in the activity you did with your father, and that notion of trying to discover what an artifact tells you is your practice and continuation of the artifact tells you how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, I think communication is at the heart of all these things, right? So, and it's, sort of a clear modernist tenet to think about, organizing information and clarifying use and so on. And so I think that there's a lot of truth to that. For sure, the idea that the object communicates its function is central. Yeah, that's true.
Okay, well, maybe one final question. You get the last word tonight. This is good stuff.
I'm not sure what my question is.
We can just talk if you
You're
want.
kind of this expert, and I really love the parafunctionality and the innate gesture that you seem to accomplish. I'm just wondering, is that based off of your own sort of experience, or where do you find is this just through personal observation that happens, in the studio, or, is it outside the studio?
When you say gesture, do you mean the
Sort of the combining of the striking of the match on the cast iron.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, it happens sometimes, I guess, in the studio. We're looking at, the research that leads to the end product is always kind of getting your hands on whatever product it is that you're trying to understand, or mining the situation that you're trying to investigate opportunities in. For me, it's always very experiential, and in the case of the Menorah, we were, lighting those things and trying, but also thinking about the ritual and the history behind it. And that was a very interesting kind of project to look at. So it's always through testing, it's always through observation, it's always through looking at the marketplace. I regularly, when I start a project, one of the first things I do is, if the project is looking at a specific object, like the stool, for example, one of the first things I do is I look at the history of stools, and so in that case, we have this huge kind of lookbook of, shaker stools and African stools, and looking at every culture that we can get our hands on, and why something was developed within the set of constraints and the rationales and the cultural baggage that led to answering a question in a certain way. And in looking at those and laying those things out in as broad a kind of way as possible, we could start to see what opportunities there were, and what, if any, universal needs there might be in today's world. So in that case, there was a lot of that kind of research that was done. And then once the broad net is thrown out and you see what's been done, there's always a question of, well, what's relevant now? What do people do now? And so it's this kind of exhaustive looking at everything that's peripheral to that opportunity, and then of course boiling in all the technological constraints and the material, and in that case we had to think about how many we could get into, how many boxes we can get onto a pallet, and all, it's just huge kind of set of things that you have to juggle, that you have to boil down into, what is the opportunity. And then once you get there, it's this kind of, like you saw, this kind of iterative study of actual forms and actual materials, and how is it going to fit? How is it going to contextualize? So it's just it's a huge process, and in the end, it sort of ends up looking simple. But it's not. Yeah.
I think it might have been Edison that said, invention is sort of 10% inspiration and 90% perspiration. But I think you bring another component to this, and that is contemplation. So there's a whole, especially in the world that we live in today, where we can sort of Google anything, and there's all sorts of incoming inputs. It's all inputs. The notion of being able to contemplate something and sort out what down to simple, I think is really, I'm really grateful. I think everyone's grateful that you're here. So thank you very, very much for
Thank you.
sharing your.